This is a special edition of the TC Pride Podcast and the Domestic Abuse Project Podcast, recorded on location at Domestic Abuse Project and OutFront, Minnesota. Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Domestic Abuse Project Podcast and the Twin Cities Pride Podcast. We're on location at OutFront, Minnesota with Eva Wood, director of OutFront's anti-violence program. Eva, how you doing? Happy Pride.
Happy Pride, Ryan. Thanks for coming here.
So like I said, this episode is a special collaboration between OutFront Minnesota, Domestic Abuse Project, and Twin Cities Pride that we're doing to talk about something that really all three organizations are working hard to educate the broader community about, and that's domestic violence within the LGBTQ community. So we'll be talking to Eva here in just a couple of minutes about that very topic. But first, we're going to check in with Domestic Abuse Project to meet their new Director of Development and Communications and to find out about some of the great work they're doing around domestic violence prevention. Eva, thanks for being here. We'll be back to talk to you in just a few minutes. Thank you for listening to the Domestic Abuse Project Podcast and the TC Pride Podcast. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Domestic Abuse Project Podcast and the TC Pride Podcast. I'm Ryan Garza from Podletter Media, and I'm here with my new co-host, DAP's Director of Development and Communications, Aaron Zimmerman. Aaron, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and co-host is an ambitious title, but I'm excited to take it on.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride to you as well.
And so first thing I want to do is thank our audience for hanging in there. It's been a little while since our last episode, so I want to thank them for hanging in there while we kind of retooled here. And we're back, though, with an awesome episode that I'm really excited about, which we're going to talk about in a second. But first, I thought I'd give you an opportunity to formally introduce yourself to our awesome DAP podcast audience.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So like you said, Ryan, I am the Director of Development and Communications for DAP. I started about a month ago, and I'm so excited to be here. I think the work that Domestic Abuse Project is doing is very transformative. It is cutting edge. It's something that I think the community really benefits from, especially the fact that we serve the full family. And I think that's something that sets us apart from other organizations. And yeah, just a little bit on my background. I have worked most of my career in the kind of intersections between social justice and public health, working with organizations like Family Tree Clinic over in St. Paul, the Red Ribbon Ride, which is an HIV/AIDS charity bike ride, and OutFront Minnesota, which I think will be kind of a nice segue in a second here with who we'll be listening in on later, to give you a little clue there. Yeah, I am excited to build on the foundation that DAP has started and has really succeeded in the past and offer a different perspective potentially. Moving forward.
So I said Happy Pride, and that was another little clue as to what our episode is going to be about today. So what people may know, so this is June, and what people may know is that June is Pride Month. And what people might not know is that Podletter Media, so my company, we produce the Domestic Abuse Project podcast. We also produce the Twin Cities Pride podcast. And Twin Cities Pride, they're the big LGBTQ advocacy organization here in the Twin Cities. And so the festival is actually at the end of the month here, but all of June, it's just rainbows, and it's crazy. A big festival all June long. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about something that we've talked about a lot on the podcast several times, but we haven't really devoted an entire episode to yet. So today we're going to be talking about domestic violence in the LGBTQ community. And we went on location to OutFront, Minnesota, your old friends at OutFront, Minnesota, to talk to Eva Wood to get her insight on domestic violence in the LGBTQ community. So we're going to listen into that interview in just a second. But first, before we do that, would you like to tell folks what's been up at DAP the last couple of months here?
Definitely. One of the things that I think we're really excited about is our first group of young men are graduating this week from the Young Men's Group as part of the youth program here at DAP. It is a 12-week program centered around the premise that working with young people early on in the kind of cycle is extremely important in kind of shaping how they build relationships. These men are ages 13 to 18, and they show signs of abuse or have used violence in intimate partner relationships and sometimes with their families as well. And so they work through that trauma that oftentimes exists in that space, and come away with it with some skills and some techniques on how to take accountability for their actions, as well as learning how to not use violence and abuse with these relationships.
And so something else that's new at DAP, so, including you, there's been some new staff brought aboard.
Yeah, definitely. We're really excited to have Amirthani Keefe join us as our Director of Client Services. She will be leading the charge on continuing our innovative services, looking at how to grow the programs and how to serve more people. So we're excited to have her as well.
So there's some big events coming up here in the next couple of months that we're going to talk about when we come back. But first, we're going to go ahead and listen in to that interview that we did with Eva at OutFront, Minnesota. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the things that are coming up at DAP, some of the big events that we've got coming up, and wrap up the episode. Thank you for listening to this special edition of the Domestic Abuse Project podcast and the TC Pride podcast, and we'll be right back. We're on location at OutFront, Minnesota with Eva Wood, Director of OutFront's Anti-Violence Program. So Eva, we're here today to talk about domestic violence in the LGBTQ community. But first, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your background and the work you do with OutFront Minnesota?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm an attorney, and I work with survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, hate and bias crimes. The anti-violence program does their best to not turn anyone away from our services unless we assess them as the perpetrator of violence. If we assess someone as the perpetrator of violence, then our program is not the best fit for them. But because we think of violence broadly and we want to work with as many people as possible, we also work on housing and homelessness issues. We do some advocacy in schools and other systems. We do our best to provide wraparound support to people who have experienced some form of violence, whether that's interpersonal, organizational, or institutional.
So on the Domestic Abuse Project podcast, we've talked a lot, a little bit at a time, really, about domestic violence in the LGBTQ community. But we haven't really dug deep into it just yet. And so that's why we're here, to kind of get your expertise, get your insight on some of the myths, some of the statistics, maybe that would maybe be surprising to some people. And to talk about maybe some of the barriers that people in the LGBTQ community might encounter when they're trying to access services. And also the idea that abuse can often be difficult to identify, even in hetero relationships, but that there are also some complicating factors in LGBTQ relationships as well. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was some of those myths that we wanted to dispel right away.
Yeah, certainly. And so I think that one of the main myths and one of the things that can make it really hard to reach out for support or services for LGBTQ survivors is this idea that it doesn't happen in our community. Very much of the model that is in mainstream society about domestic violence involves physical violence, a man perpetrating violence against his wife or girlfriend. They're both straight. That model doesn't fit for everyone. That model often also leaves out class and race differences, and certainly leaves out LGBTQ identities. And so one of the main things I want people to know is that it absolutely does happen within the LGBTQ community. In terms of statistics, it's a little bit difficult because I think that this issue undergoes a lot of underreporting. So our data that is out there, I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers are actually much higher. But the studies that we currently use and the numbers that we have seen indicate that domestic violence between romantic relationships or in families involving LGBTQ people is at the same or higher rates of the violence that heterosexual people experience. And the violence that heterosexual people experience, depending on the study, is generally thought to be about 25% to 33% of women will experience violence at some point in their lifetime. And so our data is on par with that about 25 to 33% of LGBTQ people experience violence at some point in their lifetime. I wouldn't be at all surprised if those numbers are actually much higher than that.
So we talk about in the DAP podcast as well about how a lot of domestic violence goes unreported. And before we started recording here, you were talking about that there are actually some additional factors with LGBTQ relationships that can also lead to maybe underreporting of domestic violence?
Yeah. So any survivor faces a really difficult decision when they're deciding whether or not to disclose what has happened to them and what another person has done. We live in a society that still engages in victim blaming. So often you'll hear the question of, well, why didn't this person leave? Instead of saying, why is this person perpetrating abuse, right? So any survivor of violence faces a host of barriers to accessing support, safety, and healing. LGBTQ people can experience some specific barriers to service. And one of the biggest ones ties back in with this model of domestic abuse is only between men and women, and the man is always the perpetrator. So much of the domestic violence services that are out there are framed on a very heterosexual model. If you're a trans person and the name of the local shelter is specifically references women, are you going to feel comfortable reaching out to that agency? Additionally, if you're experiencing relationship in a violence where the other person is of the same gender as you, you know that you're going to have to out yourself to a service provider. And outing yourself can be really scary. Part of the reason it can be scary is because you also don't know what sort of a response you're going to get from a service provider. And I think that one of the things we've noticed talking with clients here is that unfortunately, and all too often, people get really negative responses from service providers. Too often, violence between two men is thought of as a fair fight, right? And a domestic violence advocate gives a man a referral to a batterers group when he calls up and he's actually the survivor in the relationship. Or between two women, it's not considered really serious. It's a woman. What is a cat fight? What's going to happen? Some of the things that the people that we work with here have told us that they've heard at other agencies is really concerning. Some of the things we've heard ourselves from advocates at other agencies is concerning, and we do our best to follow up with leadership when that happens. So outing is a huge barrier. A fear of a homophobic or a biphobic or a transphobic response is a huge barrier. That fear is entirely justified based on what our clients tell us and what we ourselves are hearing and seeing in the field. Another barrier to service is can be this idea that there's already so much stigma about LGBTQ people and LGBTQ identities in the world. And there can be pressure to not report violence or to not report negative things happening within the community because we don't want other folks to feel that their stereotypes or their negativity or their stigma ideas around LGBTQ folks are justified or correct. Additionally, abusers in all relationships often are the ones that have more social capital. But in the LGBTQ community specifically, if your abuser is really well known in the community, you know that you might risk losing a lot of friends, losing that sense of safety and that support and that community that might have been really difficult to gain. The isolation piece that LGBTQ folks often experience from their friends, from their families, then can go into the romantic relationship where they're already isolated and this person might be abusing them, but they're also their connection to the community. So that fear of losing connection to community can be a really big barrier to service.
So Domestic Abuse Project does offer services to individuals of all gender identities, all orientations. And they do have specialized services for people who maybe identify with the LGBTQ community. But organizations that offer those kinds of services to people of all gender identities and all sexual orientations are kind of few and far between. And you wanted to mention something specifically about like shelters.
Yeah, definitely. So shelter access is a huge issue for the people that we work with. Right now in the state of Minnesota, it's really difficult for men to access shelter. Cornerstone and Tubman are some of the only shelters that will explicitly work with men. Trans women often find themselves in kind of a catch-22 position. It feels really gross to even say it, but if they pass as a woman, they'll often have access to women's shelters. If they don't pass, or sometimes if their legal documents have not been changed, then they are not welcomed into women's shelters, which is really difficult for them and really wrong. And trans men often find themselves, again, in this difficult position where many shelters will welcome trans men, especially if their documents still say female. So a trans man experiencing violence might have the choice between accessing safety at a shelter in a way that will undermine his gender identity, or facing a homeless shelter or another, or staying in the abusive relationship or something else that's not as safe. And in general, I think a lot of shelters have a lot of work to do on understanding the kind of differences between sex assigned at birth, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation. There's a lot of fear about trans people, and there doesn't need to be, especially when trans people are just trying to seek safety from an abusive relationship. The last thing that should happen should be that they're getting turned away from a shelter bed because something about their body doesn't line up with what that the shelter directors think should be there.
And something else we've talked about a lot on the Domestic Abuse Project is that there are a lot of different kinds of abuse. And I'd encourage people to go back into the other episodes that we've talked about the different kinds of abuse. But we were talking before we started here, and you were saying that, often abuse can be difficult to identify for the people that are victims of abuse, and that it can be especially difficult to identify for LGBTQ people.
Yeah, I think that it can be difficult to identify abuse in all relationships, right? It's not like people get a handbook when they first start dating saying, here's what an abusive relationship looks like and here's what to do if you find yourself in it. Although I kind of wish that we had that out there and that people got it. So when there is abuse in a relationship, if it's not physical, if it's not punching and hitting and battering, most people recognize that as abusive now. But if it's verbal or emotional or psychological, that can be much more difficult to recognize. Abusers are often really good at getting their victims to blame themselves. So if everyone else thinks this person is a great person, and I'm the only one who's having a problem with them, the problem must be me, not the way they're treating me. So that's true for all survivors. But then when it comes specifically to LGBTQ survivors, the way I kind of think of it is that all abusers have a toolkit that they use to further the abuse in the relationship. And abusers of LGBTQ folks have a couple of additional tools. For instance, maybe the survivor is not out to their family. Abuser threatens to out them if they leave. Maybe a trans person is on their partner's health insurance. If they end the relationship, they lose access to their health care. Maybe it's a relationship between two women, and one woman is the biological mother of the children. Other woman has been involved in caretaking for the children for years, a long time, but father's still involved in the child's life, still has his legal rights. Minnesota doesn't recognize more than two legal parents for a child, so if the biological mother of the children is also the abuser, she can say, you leave me, you're never going to see those kids again. And she has a fairly strong legal argument there. Another kind of extra tool that abusers can use is again, that social capital piece. No one's going to believe you. No one's going to think that I would do this. I work on, this committee. I work at this nonprofit. No one's going to believe you. I think abusers of LGBTQ people can also traffic on stereotypes, right? Like an abuser of a bisexual person might say, well, you're bisexual, so of course you're more likely to be promiscuous or to cheat on me, so I better see your phone so I can make sure you're not doing that. Maybe an abuser of a trans person traffics on the body dysphoria that trans people experience, or some trans people experience, of no one else is ever going to love you, no one else is going to want to date you, insults about their body, insults about whether or not they're actually men or women, or insults about being non-binary or genderqueer. So all of the things that any abuser can do, abusers in LGBTQ relationships can also do, but they get a couple of extra ways that they can exploit or intimidate or harass their victims because of the overarching power structures in society that disenfranchise LGBTQ people.
And what I think is interesting is that most people think of Minnesota as a pretty progressive state, but just sitting here listening to you, it really seems like a lot of the laws that we have still really need to catch up to a lot of these specific situations that you outlined. And you said before when we were talking here, you had also said that OutFront has had some success advocating for people's rights in some of those cases where the laws haven't really caught up to our culture. And just as a side note, if there are people listening to this that do find themselves in one of the situations that you just talked about, they can reach out to OutFront, and there are usually avenues that you can pursue to help them.
Yes, absolutely. People can always reach out to our anti-violence program. We are happy to work with folks. We would love to sit down with you and talk about how you might be able to find safety and healing and what route would look best for you. So when it comes to the laws piece, I will say I think in Minnesota we actually do have some really strong laws. Minnesota Human Rights Act we were the first state to ever include gender identity and sexual orientation in our Human Rights Act with imperfect language, but still that was laws back in 1993. Minneapolis was actually the first city ever to protect gender identity in their city code all the way back in 1975. So the laws in Minnesota, for the most part, are pretty good. The language for domestic abuse is written in a gender-neutral way. The language for sexual violence is written in a gender-neutral way. However, there's a big gap often between what's on the books legislatively and what people's lived realities are. So even if the law for domestic abuse is written in a gender-neutral way, but a police officer shows up and sees two men and assumes it's a fight, then he's not going to follow the same procedure that he would for domestic violence. That would involve separating the parties, giving resources. Sometimes 911 operators will code violence between people of the same gender as a simple assault, or basically saying it's a fight as opposed to domestic violence. Additionally, the police don't always follow proper procedure, even when they know it's domestic violence, based on what we've heard from our clients. And I think we're seeing improvements. As the anti-violence program, we work with both the Minneapolis and the St. Paul police. Minneapolis police has a specific LGBTQ liaison who does really great work with us and is always responsive to following up with us when our clients tell us about something that's gone wrong when they tried to access law enforcement. But I think the gap in understanding can cause inequitable enforcement of the laws that do exist. And again, that model that assumes that unless someone's a woman with a black eye, that abuse hasn't really happened can be really damaging. And that assumption is damaging to straight people too, because straight people obviously experience really emotional and verbal and psychological violence too. So when I sense resistance from mainstream service providers on LGBTQ inclusion, one thing I really try and emphasize is so much of anti-LGBTQ bias is very much tied up in with your plain old garden variety sexism against women and denigration of femininity. And so we're working towards the same goal. It's not as though adding LGBTQ inclusion to a mainstream service provider is going to take anything away from straight women accessing those services. In fact, I think it makes more room for people to be their whole selves. Or like we were talking about before, maybe a bisexual woman's being battered by a man. Everyone assumes that she's straight because her relationship looks straight, but her abuser has, again, those extra things because she's bisexual to use against her in that relationship. And so I think that where we've had success when it comes to kind of pushing for, there are some changes in the laws I would definitely like to make. Where we've had success is really reaching out to people and doing education and training. And the way you change hearts and minds is by relating to people and having people understand and see this as a problem that they can be part of and they can help fix. And the one law piece that I would touch on that I think does really need to change is the federal legislation, VAWA, and the Office of Violence Against Women, which funds a lot of shelters and a lot of domestic violence agencies around the country, has created a very difficult position for shelters, where they require shelters to provide equal services to people of all genders. But they also allow shelters to be sex segregated if that is essential for the continuation of the program. So what they're saying is you have to work with people of all genders, but we're not going to give you more money to have, say, a separate wing for men and a separate wing for non-binary and genderqueer people. It's provide equal services, but don't let them into the shelter. And that's not possible. You can't provide equal services when the most you offer is a hotel motel stay for 3 to 4 days, and someone who could go into the shelter gets a month to 2 months, right? So I do think that federal legislation needs to address this difficult position that they've put shelters in. I don't have hopes of that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
So we talked about how abuse can be difficult to identify and how great it would be if there was a handbook, right? When you're starting on a relationship, how to identify abuse. There's probably something out there, but one thing we wanted to do is we wanted to maybe touch on some resources for people, even something as simple as that. Maybe if someone is in a situation and they're wondering if the relationship that they're in is a healthy one, what are some resources that you could direct someone to when they're considering those things?
Yeah, well, again, I would encourage people to reach out to our program. We're happy to talk through the experience that you're having in a relationship. We can talk through, what does it look like for something to be abusive? What does it look like for someone to attempt to take, your agency and your power away? And so, but other resources are definitely out there. I encourage folks to reach out to Cornerstone. Day One, which is a statewide agency that refers people to different shelters, is doing a lot of really great work around LGBTQ inclusion. Tubman will specifically work with men. There are mental health resources for LGBTQ folks. There's a LGBTQ therapist network that we could set people up with or show them. Reclaim is a really great agency for LGBTQ youth experiencing mental health issues. And then there's a website that I recommend for people to check out. It's called loveisrespect.org. There are a lot of materials and resources on that website for folks to read. An article that lists warning signs that a relationship is abusive, an article about the myth of mutual abuse, which is another myth we didn't really touch on, but is something that happens all the time, where an abuser says, oh, well, we're abusing each other. This is a toxic relationship. I called you all these names and you called me names back, and so we're abusing each other. But mutual abuse is actually really, really, really rare. I think that generally, even if a survivor reacts in a way that might look abusive on the outside, but is done in a reactive way, is done without that desire for power and control, it's not mutual abuse. So loveisrespect.org is a really good resource for folks.
And for folks who are in the situation of trying to determine whether or not the relationship that they're in is a healthy one, like I said, there are a lot of different forms of abuse. But like you just touched on, you said that sort of the one thing that they all have in common, that all these different forms of abuse have in common, is that desire for power and control.
Yes, definitely. And that desire can be conscious or unconscious. So sometimes abusers might say, well, no, I just love my partner so much. I love them so much. I need them to check in with me and let them know where they are because I love them. But if you dig down under, do they need their partner to check in with them constantly every hour when they're not together because of love, or because they want to know what their partner is doing and they want to make sure their partner is thinking about them, right? So if we're trying to determine who is gaining power and control in this relationship, we can look at whose world is getting smaller as a result of the abuse, and if someone's world is getting smaller because they're obsessing about the abuse, or if someone's world is getting smaller because they're being controlled and being told to fixate and focus on their abuser all the time.
And when you talk about someone's world getting smaller, it's that isolation piece that we've talked about a lot on the Domestic Abuse Project.
Yes, definitely.
And so the main reason we came to you was for your insight into this issue, working with it every day. Is there anything just from your experience or from your perspective that you'd like to say to people out there who may be experiencing any of these things that we've talked about today?
Yeah, if for anyone who's listening who might be thinking, is this my relationship? Or, oh, those things have happened to me? Or am I in an abusive relationship? Or maybe you know that you are. One thing I would like to say is that I believe you. You don't deserve it. You deserve safety and healing and happiness. There's nothing that you have done in this relationship to make the other person act this way or do these things. And you deserve to be free and happy.
And like I said, I mean, right now, organizations that are able to offer services to people within the LGBTQ community are few and far between. But there are a lot of organizations that are in the process of developing programs to be able to serve LGBTQ people. And for organizations that are trying to figure out the best path forward in being inclusive of people with those identities, what would you say to those people?
Yeah. Well, I highly recommend that agencies that want to be LGBTQ inclusive, which I think really is most. I do think that most folks doing domestic violence work really have good intentions at heart and want everyone to have safety and healing. So I think that a big recommendation I have would be to get LGBTQ competency training. Don't make maybe there's one or two LGBTQ folks on staff. Don't make them be the LGBTQ encyclopedia for the rest of the staff. Bring outside trainers in. OutFront offers training. Minnesota Transgender Health Coalition offers training. Reclaim offers training. There are individual LGBTQ activists who do really great trainings around the cities. And so have outside training come in. Have it be more than an hour. Too often I think folks do an hour lunch and learn. It's like, oh, we had an hour training. We're totally good on this subject. Have it be more than an hour. There needs to be follow-up. There needs to be policies in place, both about LGBTQ inclusion for staff and LGBTQ inclusion for service provision. Sometimes I hear, oh, well, I would treat everyone the same. So that's how I know I'm being equal. Right, but sometimes you need to treat people a little bit differently in order to actually have equitable services. So, and a big piece of that is education. The last thing that an LGBTQ person needs or should be doing when they're reaching out for services is educating their service provider about their identity. Right, if you're genderqueer and you use they and them pronouns, and the advocate that you're calling at a mainstream agency doesn't understand that or asks you what that means, then you already have a hunch that someone doesn't have maybe a base of knowledge about your identity, and you might be less likely to follow follow through with reaching out for services. So get training, get extensive training, have it be more than an hour, have policies in place so that when a trans woman is accessing shelter, all staff are on the same page. Another thing we've noticed is that often when I talk with leadership at mainstream agencies, the executive director or the director of the programming will say, of course we're LGBTQ inclusive. Of course we work with LGBTQ folks. And then I hear from my client that, maybe he's a man called this agency and he was given a referral to a batterers group, right? There wasn't even any intake or screening done. So I think sometimes there's a gap between what the agency wants to have happen and maybe what their goals are, and maybe there isn't the follow through that needs to be in educating all of the staff and all the volunteers about what the goals and the priorities are. And it's important to prioritize LGBTQ inclusion, right? Yes, LGBTQ folks are a smaller percentage of the population, but because of all these barriers and things that we've talked about, right, they experience the same rates or even higher rates of violence. There is a need for LGBTQ inclusive service provision. OutFront Minnesota's anti-violence program, we can't do it all. We need other agencies to work with us on this topic too. And so having leadership make a commitment to LGBTQ inclusion, having training, education, and then implementing those policies are some of our recommendations.
And we mentioned that OutFront Minnesota does offer several services to victims of not just domestic violence, but violence in other areas. So what are some of these specific services that OutFront provides to the community?
Yeah. So first of all, we have a crisis line that you can call. The number is 612-822-0127, option 3. You can call that number at any point. We're in the process of implementing a full 24-hour service provision for a crisis line. Right now, after business hours, the crisis line rolls over to my cell phone. I do my best to answer it at all times and at all hours. That's not long term. That's when we're in the process of implementing this 24-hour process. I guarantee that any person who leaves a message on my cell phone will get a call back from me within 24 hours. So you can call our crisis line. You can email us. We have an online report form on our website where you can report violence that happened to you. And we offer up to 12 sessions of free peer counseling. We offer support groups twice a year. There will be a support group for survivors of relationship abuse starting up again in the fall. We just wrapped one up. We offer accompaniment to police stations, to hospitals, to court, if folks want to access those systems. I provide full legal representation for folks who meet our screening criteria and family law matters in order for protection hearings, harassment restraining order hearings, custody issues. I also do advocacy in housing and tenant rights, and then I do consultations about employment law, criminal law issues. I don't take those on for full representation because I don't have that expertise. We also offer some assistance. We can offer emergency assistance with transportation, with food, with housing, with clothing, with your utility bill, again, if the screening criteria is met. And if you call us or email us, we will do our best to figure out a way to support you that is holistic. So it's not that someone calls us, tell us about the relationship violence that they're experiencing, and we only work on the relationship violence. If that relationship violence has caused an issue with their landlord or their neighbors, we work on that too. We try to implement services that will allow people to be their whole selves and live their life without fear of violence.
And don't be afraid to call the crisis line too, right? We've talked to other folks out and about in the course of doing the TC Pride podcast. Mm-hmm. And just like abuse can sometimes be difficult to identify, sometimes it can be difficult to identify if a situation is a crisis or not. So you encourage people to call and maybe get some assistance with determining whether it's actually a crisis or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Our crisis line is for all folks who might be fearing for their safety, wondering about avenues that they would like to take. Our crisis line does not mean you have to be actively in crisis in that moment. Our crisis line is for LGBTQ folks. We work with straight folks too who are experiencing violence, but it is geared and aimed towards helping LGBTQ folks who have experienced some form of violence, whether interpersonal, whether organizational, whether institutional, or structural. We want to talk with folks. We want to help them.
And you also wanted to mention something about what you refer to as a solidarity model.
Yeah, so our vision in AVP is very intentionally a solidarity model as opposed to a charity model. We recognize that we are lucky to work with people as opposed to thinking that we're doing something for someone, which is more of a charity model. And so we recognize that everyone who calls us is the expert of their own life. Our job is to listen, our job is to validate, our job is to believe, and then our job is to work with the survivor of violence to figure out what path feels best for them.
So thank you, Eva, for all the awesome information. It really sounds like OutFront really does a lot for the community. And for folks out there who are listening who would like to support the work that OutFront is doing, What are some ways that people can do that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, like I said, we're in the process of implementing a full 24-hour crisis line where people can reach a person trained in LGBTQ advocacy 24 hours of the day. So we need folks to come take our advocate training starting on July 17th, running through August 5th. It is a 42-hour domestic violence, sexual violence advocacy training that would certify you to volunteer with us or at other agencies. So that would be great if folks are interested in that. Just send me an email at ewood@outfront.org. You can always donate. Our development program will be very happy if I say, please go to outfront.org/donate if that is within your means and is something that would work for you. The other thing that you can do to support us is sign up for our e-news on our website to stay abreast of what we're working on and what we're doing. Basically, if you want to get involved, just come to our website or send one of us an email, and we would love to work with you.
Eva, thank you so much again for being here, and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Hello and welcome back to the Domestic Abuse Project podcast and the TC Prod podcast. I'm Ryan Garza here with Aaron Zimmerman. And so we just listened into an interview with Eva Wood. What a great interview.
Yeah, one of those really amazing perspectives. I've got a lot of respect for Eva, having worked with her in the past. It's those kind of perspectives and that kind of community collaboration that I think it makes the work we do so transformative. It's something that Domestic Abuse Project is really cognizant of, is that domestic abuse affects no one particular type of person, no one particular type of socioeconomic situation, race, age, and as we see here, gender identity and sexual orientation. Domestic Abuse Project is very committed to never turning anyone away, including the fact that we're one of the few organizations in the Twin Cities that offers a sliding scale fee for our services. And also, if someone doesn't feel comfortable in one of our group settings, we often work individually with those people in order to provide the best services possible. I definitely think there's some really exciting and interesting things on the horizon. More to come on that, I guess.
And as we wrap up here, we should probably talk about a couple of big events that are coming up here at DAP over the next few months.
Yeah, as I come into this position, I've got some things that I'm really excited about. On October 11th, Wednesday, October 11th, we have our Transforming Families Luncheon. This is a free event where we encourage community members to come together and support the work that DAP is doing. It's at the Earl Brown Center in Brooklyn Center from 12 until 1 p.m., so it's a quick hour where we share the stories and the vision of Domestic Abuse Project. And what we're looking for right now from the community is individuals who are committed and passionate about domestic violence work and the work that DAP is specifically doing to lead a group of friends, family members, and coworkers as a table captain at the event. And what this entails is just sharing why you're passionate about the particular work that we're doing with your friends and family. Invite them to this lunch and share with them the work that we're doing.
And then one thing we should probably mention too is that, so if people are out there listening and this sounds, the idea of being a table captain sounds interesting, but maybe they're a little nervous because, well, I've never done it before. And so I think we've actually talked about recently about how DAP will actually help you if this is your first time. There's like a buddy program or something too to help you out. So reach out to Aaron or anyone here, and they'll get you on the right path. And the other thing too is sometimes people think that they don't know 10 people, but it always turns out that it's a lot easier to fill a table than people seem to think sometimes.
And we have another really great event coming up on August 5th from 2 to 6 p.m. It's Bags and Beers for Nat, hosted by Love Conquers Violence. They're actually, they hosted this amazing event at the Herkimer that is an afternoon to celebrate and remember Natalie Beisel, who lost her life to domestic violence. And the proceeds from the event actually go in part to Domestic Abuse Project. And for the second year in a row, we're really excited to partner with Love Conquers Violence. So please check out their Facebook group. It's under Bags and Beers for Nat, and there's opportunities there to purchase your tickets to either join the Bags tournament or to come as a spectator.
And if people are maybe like outside of the Twin Cities and they can't actually make it to the event, they're more than welcome to go to loveconquersviolence.com to find out how they can support the organization in other ways. Well, great. That's a couple of things that are coming up here in the next couple of months. And then as we wrap up, probably one more thing we should talk about is our next episode.
Yeah, I'm really excited about our next episode as part of the curriculum we're doing, this Domestic Violence 101 programming. The upcoming episode is going to be self-care and protection planning. So we'll bring in a therapist here at DAP to discuss those issues and talk through that and what role it plays in domestic violence.
Thank you, Aaron, for jumping in and getting the ball rolling again with us. And if people want to get a hold of you, people want to get involved with the things that you're working on specifically, how can people get a hold of you?
Definitely. I'm an open door. So please reach out to me if you have any questions. My email address is azimmerman, Zimmerman, at mindap.org. And our phone number is 612-874-7063, extension 207. So definitely reach out if you have any questions about being a table captain or how you can get involved with the work we're doing here.
Well, thanks again, Aaron, and thank you for listening to the Domestic Abuse Project podcast and the TC Pride podcast. We'll see you next time.
The TC Pride podcast is a production of Podletter Media and Twin Cities Pride. The Domestic Abuse Project podcast is a production of Podletter Media and the Domestic Abuse Project. Subscribe now on iTunes, on Android, or on YouTube at tcpridepodcast.org and dappodcast.org.